Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this launching event of the special issue on the centenary or the centennial of History and Class Consciousness by Georg Lukács, a special issue organized by myself and Victor Strazzeri for the journal Dissonancia, the Brazilian journal Dissonancia, critical theory journal. Today we're going to have the first launching event. There's a second one that will take place in Spanish for the Latin American participants. Today we have the English-speaking authors of the special issue. Before we start with the presentations and everything, I'll present a little bit about the journal and the special issue, and then we'll go to the presentations. But before I present the journal and the special issue, my name is Mariana Teixeira. I'm assistant researcher at the Praxis Philosophy Research Group here at the University of Lisbon. And I edited this special issue together with Victor Strazzeri. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Federal University in São Paulo. Before I present the journal and the special issue, perhaps I would give the floor to Victor for him just to give a brief overview of how it's going to play out this session today. Please, Victor.
Thanks, Mariana. Very glad to be here. I was just checking our emails and we first started to discuss this in mid-2022. So this is almost 2 years of work now that is kind of coming to a conclusion. So just to say a little bit how it's going to go today, we have 2 parts in our live stream. The first will be dedicated to the articles that were published in the special issue. We have 4 authors of 3 papers who will speak more or less 15 minutes each about the pieces they wrote for us, and then we'll have time for questions. If you have questions and you were able to join us at this hour, you can send them via YouTube. We'll ask some questions ourselves to the authors as well, and hear from them. And then in the second part, myself and Mariana will be talking to Mirela Ivanova, who is a PhD student at the University of Basel. And we'll be talking about the HCC Reader that is also a part of this dossier, which has not only articles, but a lot of different interventions related to the Centennial of History and Class Consciousness. And this one in particular is a reader. It's basically a commentary on every preface and essay of the journal, which was written by a collective of comrades. But so that's how it will work. I'll give the floor back to Mariana to begin the first part.
Thank you, Victor. So before I give the word to Till to present his article, I just wanted to present the journal. It's called Dissonancia, or Dissonance in English, Critical Theory Journal, and it was created around since 2017 in the University of Campinas in Brazil. And it was created within the Critical Theory Research Group of the university, conducted by Professor Marcos Nobre and Professor Inara Marim. This group was created some 20 years ago, I think. And since the launching of the journal in 2017, we have already published special issues on many topics related to critical theory, so psychoanalysis, feminism, decolonial theory, special issue on Adorno, Marcuse, Walter Benjamin, the idea of counterpublics, populism, so a number of different topics. And I think it was perhaps the first journal in Brazil dedicated to critical theory specifically, and but its reach is far beyond Brazil. So we see here that we have also the participation and the contribution by authors and scholars from around the world. And we are very happy to have the opportunity to organize this special issue on Lukács that was the 100 years of history and class consciousness last year. The special issue comprises not only 7 original articles by authors from many different places, as you will see today, but also we have a translation into Portuguese of a text by Fúrio Ceruti on Lukács and critical theory. We also have a book review on the book Georg Lukács and critical theory by Tyrus Miller. A set of very brief interviews with many scholars about the impact of history and class consciousness in their intellectual trajectory, and also the HCC Reader that Victor will present a little bit more in detail, and we'll discuss it in the second part of this event. The general idea was to try to reflect on Lukács not only as a part of a crucial figure in the development of Marxism and critical theory in the last century, but to think about its potential to understand the present as well. So we wanted to bring the discussion about Lukács not only as a philological or a history of the archives of critical theory and Marxism and historical materialism, but also as something that might give us tools to understand the present. Okay, so that's the general idea. I'm going to give the floor to Til in a second, but I wouldn't like to forget to give my big thanks to Paul Reynolds and the Historical Materialism channel for hosting this event. And also I wanted to thank the collective work of everyone that took part in the special issue, not only the authors, not only Victor, my co-organizer, and the people from the editorial team of the journal, but also the anonymous reviewers that so often go unrecognized, but that have provided very interesting feedback on the articles. And there was a very interesting discussion taking place in the background for this special issue before the special issue was out. So it was very interesting to take part in that. And now let's go then to the first article. So Til Hahn contributed to the special issue with the article Time's Carcass, Marx and Lukács on Abstract Time and the Capitalist Order of Appearance. And Til is teaching assistant in philosophy at the Leuphana, I hope I pronounced that correctly, University Lüneburg in Germany. So Til, you have 10 to 15 minutes to give a brief presentation of your paper, and we'll go each author in turn, and then we'll open the discussion, okay? So Til, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, and thanks also to the audience for joining us, and especially to the editors of this special issue for giving me the opportunity to present my thoughts on Lukács and Marx, and kind of nudging me into the direction of kind of making them more precise. So yeah, as Mariana already said, my paper was entitled Time's Carcass, Marx and Lukács on Abstract Time and the Capitalist Order of Appearance. Yeah, so my paper examines Marx's and Lukács' concept of time in relation to the capitalist order of appearance. And it argues that Marx, as well as Lukács, weaponized a certain understanding of abstract time for the critique of capitalism that can be traced back to Kant's transcendental aesthetics. It argues that time as inner sense, as Kant has put it in his transcendental aesthetics, under capitalism becomes the inner sense of capital understood as an automatic subject. My argument basically is threefold. So I'll start by kind of examining the politics of time that is embedded in the sort of Marxist understanding of reification that is brought forth by Lukács, and also Marx in a different sense. I will then look a bit more into this idea of reification of time in relation to this idea of Kant, and then I finished by some remarks on the meaning of the term automatic subject in Capital. So the title of my paper basically comes from a quote that is found in The Poverty of Philosophy, which is sort of interesting as kind of a document of Marx's struggle with the understanding of political economy after the Parisian manuscripts. Yeah, so I think I just read the quote in length here. Quote, competition, according to an American economist, determines how many days of simple labor are contained in one day's composed labor. Does not this reduction of days or compound labor to days of simple labor suppose that simple labor is itself taken as a measure of value? If the mere quantity of labor functions as a measure of value, regardless of quality, it presupposes that the simple labor has become the pivot of industry. It presupposes that labor has been equalized by the subordination of man to the machine or by the extreme division of labor, that men are effaced by their labor, that the pendulum of the clock has become as accurate a measure of the relative activity of two workers as it is of the speed of two locomotives. Therefore, we should not say that one man's hour is worth another man's hour, but rather that one man during an hour is worth just as much as another man during an hour. Time is everything, man is nothing, he is at the most time's carcass. Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. Also because, I mean, that's kind of a footnote to that this term of time's carcass was kind of effaced by the first translation into German by Karl Kautsky and Eduard Bernstein, which translated that this phrase of time's carcass as embodiment of time. Yeah, we're already at the center of the this kind of problem of politics of time that kind of is the first point of my paper, where I argue that kind of with the revisionist stance of German social democracy, we have on the one hand, we have kind of a fall into a subscription to the bourgeois idea of a steady progress over time. Whilst on the other hand, of course, we have the revolutionary or Leninist idea of a sort of a kairos, where we have kind of the revolution coming on one day X, and it's kind of an event outside of time, and we kind of have to navigate between these two extremes of ideas. So philosophically, the philosophy of appearance that is at the core of Lukács's idea of reification. So the question of how, within the totality of capitalism, a thing can appear, or social relations can appear in things. Rather, we're also already politically at the heart of the question of opportunism or orthodoxy. So Lukács's critique is mainly a critique of revisionism, especially kind of the revisionism of that is brought forth by social democratic theory pre-World War I and then also in the Weimar Republic. And just to remind you of that very quickly, revisionism kind of can be summarized as a sort of empirist reading of Marxist theory of economy. So basically, Bernstein's point is that in Capital, Marx kind of gave an analysis of a certain historical empirical state of capitalism, and because now, meaning pre-World War I, the German Empire, or even today, we are in a different empirical point of capitalism. Therefore, we need a new form of capital analysis, right? So Lukács's critique of this is that revisionism does not recognize this theory of fetishism, and thus fails to conceptualize the capitalist totality. So what I called in my paper the philosophy of appearance of Marx, and then by extension of Lukács, is the theory or the kind of the theoretization of the fact that in capitalism we do not have like merely given sensual data that we can work from, but the capitalist totality always provides us with a certain form of appearance that is historically determined. So this is basically the question of class consciousness put into philosophical terms, to make it short. Yeah, so this question of class consciousness gets problematic in revisionism because, as Rosa Luxemburg has put it, this revisionist theory transforms the question of class versus class, like the proletariat class versus the bourgeois class, into a mere question of rich versus poor, right? The question that Lukács puts up against this, which I marked as the question of totality, is, as I said, the question of a field in which appearances can appear under historically determined form. And this historically determined form, of course, is the value form. And the value form, which is derived from abstract labor, presupposes a certain order of time, which I argue. Yeah, this order of appearance of time is reified time. So abstract reified time as different from, let's say, the time of the artisan workshop, where time is determined by how much time you need to produce a certain object. That gets replaced by the time of the factory, where you work a certain shift, like you work 8 hours or 12 hours or 16 hours or so on, but you never produce a certain object, but you only produce commodities for the capitalist. So Lukács argues at a certain point in History and Class Consciousness that through this reification of time, so time as abstract labor power, or the measure of abstract labor power that gets reified into a commodity, and thus appears not as a certain flux of time, but as a certain object in which this labor power is externalized. Through this process, time becomes a space. So what does he mean by this kind of cryptic remark? I argue that this goes back to a certain reading of Kant, who in his Transcendental Aesthetics, so the first part of his first critique, right, differentiates between the true transcendental orders of appearance, which is the spatial order, right, the space, which is the outer sense, so everything that kind of gets to us from the outside, and time as a form of inner sense that structures the subjectivity as kind of a unity in which these appearances can be can be processed. So this remark by Lukács, as I argue, that time through this order of reification becomes a space, indicates a certain shift within the subjectivity to which something appears. And this is kind of my last point in the paper, where I argue that through this reification, the subject to which the time of labor, i.e. the time that is needed to produce a certain commodity, or which is reified in a certain commodity, does not appear to the worker. So the worker is not the subject to which it appears, but it is capital itself, which Marx at one point in Capital describes as an automatic subject, which is also a kind of interesting term, which I will come back to in the end. Before I have to kind of clarify this this process a bit more. So the idea is that labor power, which is sold as a commodity, can only be sold as a commodity as abstract labor power in capitalism, because only as abstract labor power it can be used to produce surplus value, because it is exactly the split within the labor power. So at the one hand, being a concrete use value, producing value for the capitalist, and on the other hand, being a commodity, thus its price or its value being measured by the commodities that are used or needed for its reproduction. Right within this split, the condition of possibility of producing surplus value appears, because as Marx argued in Capital, for the reproduction of the labor power that you can exploit during a day of labor time, you can buy more labor time than is needed to produce the commodities to reproduce them, right? So this split is kind of where the surplus value comes from. Now coming back, why Capital by Marx is put as an automatic subject is precisely because in this process of exploitation, so in this process of valorization of value, so selbstverwertender Wert, which is basically money buying commodities and then turning them back into money. You have a sort of degree zero of subjectivity, so that is set a unity that is provided to kind of through this process of eternal shifts within this process. So you have the change of forms from money to commodity to money and so on. And you have this ever ongoing shift. There's a reminder of unity, which kind of ensures that the subject of capital stays basically the same during this process. So what the argument of Marx here is that money as capital, which of course is the medium of reification, and the subject of appearance at the same time, you have a process of appearance which is kind of separated from kind of a Kantian idea where you have a subject that kind of works through the appearances of the manifold and so on. Yeah. So I come to an end with my point here that this sort of subjectivity, or this external subjectivity, kind of clings vampire-like to the subject of the worker, and by kind of taking in this appearance of time and this reification of time. Yeah, so I basically will end my presentation, which got a bit out of hand. I'm sorry for that, with the end of my paper. So this means that revolution then is neither found in the shallow progress made through the time of circulation, nor is it a messianic event completely outside of time as such. It is the act of seizing the means of production in order to lift their separation from labor power, so that the commodification of labor power and its subordination to the time of capital may finally come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Till. That was very interesting. And I'll give directly the floor then to Matt. We'll have the discussion afterwards. Matt Sharpe is Associate Professor in Philosophy at the Australian Catholic University, and together with Matt King, who's a PhD candidate in philosophy at the same university, they contributed to the special issue with the paper Lukács' Critique of Irrationalism, from the antinomies of bourgeois thought to the destruction of reason. Thank you, Matt, for joining us, and you have also 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you to the editors of the journal and the organisers of the event. So as Mariana has indicated, our paper and Matt is unwell, and he sends his apologies and regards. Challenges ideas of a complete Lukácsian intellectual reorientation after History and Class Consciousness, HCC, into the later works, and notably the contested work, Destruction of Reason. Our argument is that Lukács' later critique of the forms of irrationalism characterizing reactionary thinking carries forward the critique of bourgeois philosophy, which is developed brilliantly, we believe, in a HCC in the chapter on the antinomies of bourgeois thought. So the paper has three parts. First part looks at the claims concerning Kantian philosophy, which I'll talk about in a moment. In that chapter, the antinomies chapter of HCC. The second part then, with the transitional figure of Fichte between the two texts, looks at Lukács' critique of what he calls irrationalism, as people know, in the Destruction of Reason, starting with the figure who he presents as the first definitively irrationalist philosopher. Fichte, I think, is a kind of liminal figure, namely Schelling. Part three then looks in closing, or raises in closing, some contemporary implications of this argument, and is probably the most, I imagine, the most controversial part of the paper, perhaps from the reviewers that was indicated. And maybe we can discuss that this evening or this morning, wherever you are in the world, this morning in Portugal. So I'll just make a presentation of, I think, the key arguments of our presentation for the journal, starting with the reading of Kant in History and Class Consciousness, which is, I think, absolutely central to understanding the position in the antinomies chapter. So, of course, if we look at Kant's philosophy, we can be struck by how there are these oppositions between phenomena and noumena, objects of experience and things in themselves, the empirical or psychological self and the transcendental subject, the formal categorical demands of rational morality and sensual empirical desires, and not least the theoretical and the practical modalities of reason. According to Lukács's chapter, The Antinomies of Bourgeois Thought in History and Class Consciousness, it's exactly Kant's willingness to posit and accept as irresolvable such fundamental oppositions, to lay them out, which attests to his significance. What Lukács attempts in his Marxian dialectic in HCC is to show that the contradictions which cut across Kant's philosophical system are the reflections in the field of philosophy of contradictions in the new bourgeois capitalist societies emerging in Europe from out of the age of revolutions. In a way which points towards the concerns of destruction of reason, or so we argue, Lukács contends that Kant's thought confronts and fails to resolve what he calls in History and Class Consciousness the problem of irrationality. This problem results from Kant's ambition, which becomes the ambition of the German idealists who follow him, to generate a philosophical system capable of explaining the totality of all phenomena. However, Lukács argues, when we reflect on how or from what such a system might emerge, and how it might as such be able to explain its own conditions of possibility, problems immediately emerge. In Kant's system, Lukács claims, the problem of irrationality shows itself in the telltale recourse to the idea of the thing in itself. This thing in itself has several distinct functions within Kant's system, but what unites them is the fact that they each represent a limit, a barrier to the abstract, formal, rationalistic human faculty of cognition. That's Lukács. At what we might term the micro level, we need to suppose, Kant says, that beyond the individual experiences as we experience them, phenomena, that there must be independently existing things in themselves. At the same time, we can't know that such experience independent things could exist, and in what manner. At the macro level, the notion of things in themselves haunts Kant's system in the transcendental dialectic of the first critique. At issue here, as Lukács glosses, is the problem of the whole and of the ultimate substance of knowledge, the problem of those ultimate objects of knowledge, which are needed to round off the partial systems into a totality, a system of the perfectly understood world, but which are, Kant argues, nevertheless unavailable. On the basis of his Marxist position, Lukács contends that Kant's metaphysical inconsistencies represent the highest intellectual expression in the domain of philosophy of the competing dynamics operating within the newly emerging bourgeois societies of post-1789 Europe. On one hand, capitalist societies, buoyed by the new sciences, were requiring increasing control over all aspects of human existence, subjecting the entire natural world to human needs and intentions. On the other hand, given the liberal capitalist bequeathing of matters of collective, material, and social reproduction to the invisible hand of the market, the governing classes were losing the possibility of gaining intellectual control of society itself. At the individual level, subjects increasingly confront a wholly created environment in which all of the challenges which could emerge seem to be amenable to coordinated rational solutions. Yet liberal thinking encourages each individual to think of herself as an isolated atom, an individual egoistic bourgeois, prey to market forces, every bit as inscrutable and indifferent as the untamed natural realities that had surrounded our ancestors. This leads to a divided existence, riven between local rationality and wholesale irrationality. Lukács brilliantly argues that it is this divided existence that finds philosophical expression in the antinomies of Kantian philosophy. The implication of his position is also clear, if controversial. To the extent that the material and historical realities of capitalist societies stay in place decisively, bourgeois thought will necessarily reproduce different metastases of Kant's oppositions and his wrestling with the problem of irrationality. So the next part of my presentation, aware of the time, and I'm aiming for 15 minutes, is really from the problem of irrationality, which is present, identified in HCC, to irrationalism. So from Kant to Fichte. So what concerns us here is, or in the paper, is how the philosophical situation set up by Kant's antinomies and his recourse to things in themselves was experienced very quickly by Kant's successors as profoundly intellectually unsatisfactory. Equally, social conditions in Germany, characterized by late state eyes nationalisation, the absence of a bourgeois revolution, equally late and rapid industrialisation in no way worked against the reproduction and deepening of the contradictions of bourgeois capitalism, which HCC had identified. In Fichte already, the attempt was therefore made to go beyond Kant's humble self-limitation about things in themselves and to develop what Lukács already calls in 1923 a doctrine of irrationality. At issue is Fichte's philosophical claim to be able to identify an irrational ground of which no account can be given for the world of our reasonable experience. In his middle work, this involves what he calls a suprarational projection, the absolute projection of an object of the origin about which no account can be given, with the result that the space between projection and thing projected is dark and void. In Fichte's later work, the grounding irrational datum becomes the famous absolute I or ego, a subject-object which notably Lukács has sometimes been charged of reproducing in different conditions in HCC. So our point in the paper is that Fichte, as analysed already in 1923 by Lukács, gives voice to a distinct constellation of philosophical positions, which he will later come in Destruction of Reason to call irrationalism. There is one, the appeal to an actual intuition which would transcend the boundaries of ordinary experience, and which, as Lukács notes, will soon enough become linked in Fichte to a philosophical freighting of aesthetic experience. Secondly, there is the denomination of an inexplicable ground for all facticity, which this intuition could access. This intuition that is, as against anything like fallibilistic, repeatable observation, induction, or corroboration. Thirdly, there's also the way that the irresolvable problem of groundlessness itself becomes its own solution or grounding ontological principle. The identifying of an absence of ground becomes itself a kind of ground. With Fichte's positing of such an irrational ground for possible experience, unavailable to forms of scientific or dialectical cognition, we encounter an avatar of the kinds of foundational principles, Lukács argues, which will soon be elevated by later irrationalist thinkers as the basis for their own particular romantic and vitalist criticisms of modern life. So the last little part of what I want to say this evening, or this morning, my apologies, I think I have like 3 or 4 minutes, is to then make the connection from Fichte to Schelling, having made the connection from Kant to Fichte within the terms of HCC. And now we're going to move to Destruction of Reason. So intellectually, Destruction of Reason makes clear that philosophical irrationalism from Fichte into Schelling and beyond is a response to the same philosophical problems which Kant confronted so honestly, the limits of the determinants of the understanding, giving rise to irresolvable contradictions and antinomies. And reflective, Lukács argues, of the socio-political conditions facing modern subjects in reified, commodified, marketized societies, or reifying societies. Irrationalism is born philosophically out of a hypostization of the inability of specific forms of philosophical cognition to comprehend reality. Irrationalism transforms this inability into a claimed inability of thought as such, and posits that reality exceeds rational, scientific, or dialectical disclosure. So this is the argumentative continuity between HCC's critique of Kant via Fichte into the critique of Schelling and then beyond Schopenhauer, Nietzsche and the others in 1954. While Kant had speculated about intellectual intuition in a merely provisional and speculative manner, in Schelling we get a supposed direct intellectual intuition of things, which becomes the organon of philosophical knowledge, transcending the categories of understanding. He specifies that there can be no reason dialectical bridges or mediating links between understanding and the realities that intellectual intuition could access. Quote, intellectual intuition cannot be interpreted or communicated through description nor through concepts. It involves instead, quote, the leap into authentic intuitive philosophy. This also means that the intellectual intuition, the ground of this objective idealism, isn't something able to be taught, nor should it, noting the aristocratic accent, be obliged to pay special heed to all those incapable of it. It is more proper to cut it off in terms of access to ordinary knowledge on all sides, says Schelling. In this way, we find in the young Schelling the first developments of a key feature of subsequent philosophical irrationalism. This is what Lukács calls aristocratic epistemology, that limits the organon, the basis of truth, to a few select geniuses possessing higher insight or intellectual intuition. Nearly finished. Schelling also already takes this distinctly romantic turn. Just as Schopenhauer would claim that art can access the noumenal will underlying ordinary experience, Schelling positions artistic genius as the organon of world perception. Artistic genius and intellectual intuition available only to a refined elite then becomes the basis for a critique of modern marketized societies on a very different basis from anything like, evidently, a Marxist tradition. As in HCC, and indeed in the young Hegel, Lukács stresses that why this matters is insofar as irrationalism emerges on the basis of and as an attempt to resolve in the intellectual realm, that is, without any concrete material change, the deep contradictions of modern capitalist societies. As far as Lukács is concerned, the inner development of Schelling's philosophy itself matters less than the change in the objective social situation in Germany. Schelling himself was summoned to Berlin in the 1840s, and his religiously inflected system was embraced by Prussian circles around Friedrich Wilhelm IV as the most up-to-date means to, quote, challenge the forms of left Hegelianism, which had furnished, quote, an ideological basis for the ultra-leftist bourgeois democrat struggle on the eve of democratic revolution. Then, as we know, the contention of destruction of reason is that with the increasing crises conditions in the imperial and then interwar period in German society, the motifs of philosophical irrationalism become vulgarized and popularized and then begin to inform and make possible the eventual collapse of German politics into the Nazi period. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Matt. So now from Germany and then Australia, now we're going to Greece and Ireland with the presentation by Costas, Gousis, and Alexandros Minotakis. Briefly, Costas is postdoctoral researcher in Democracy and Crisis, the Democrisis Project at the Pantheon University of Social and Political Sciences in Athens, Greece. And Alexandros is postdoctoral researcher in digital policy at the University College Dublin in Ireland. And their paper for the special issue was titled The Question of Organization, Examining Lukács' Conceptual Roadmap for Social Change. Thank you so much for being here. You also have 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mariana. We would like to begin with a big thanks to both you, Mariana, and Victor for your great work to editing this special issue and bringing all of us together. And of course, big thanks to Paul Reynolds and Historical Materialism for hosting this event. So, as Mariana already mentioned, our article, our contribution to this special issue is entitled The Question of Organization, Examining Lukács' Conceptual Road for Social Change. And we decided to dedicate our article to the memory of Giorgos Maniatis, who died the day we were about to submit our article. Professor Maniatis has been one of those from the older generation of Greek intellectuals and comrades who always encouraged us to read, reread, discuss, and write on Lukács. So our article explores aspects of Lukács' contribution to a philosophy of the party, his distinctive approach to political practice, and his defense of the alternative. The concepts of reification, totality, and mediation are explored in our article, drawing from contemporary rereadings of his work, and in particular drawing from Mark Fisher's and Frederick Jameson's thoughts on these concepts in their engagements with Lukács' work. To understand Lukács' contribution to a methodology of the problem of organization, we begin with an examination of reification as it relates to the problem of immediacy. As Mark Fisher notes, one of the key conceptual insights of Lukács is that immediacy is reifying, since it is inherently ideological and ideologically mystifying, turning what is always a process of becoming, which is open-ended and therefore changeable, into something that is fixed and permanent. Is there a way out? Lukács firmly defends the hypothesis that reification can be overcome only by constant and constantly renewed efforts to disrupt the reified structure of existence by concretely relating to the concretely manifested contradictions of the total development, by becoming conscious of the immanent meanings of these contradictions for the total development. Only then does the concept of totality becomes effectively central, meaning, drawing again from Mark Fisher, a set of relations not given in immediacy. Or, as Frederick Jameson puts it, at some very basic level, the aspiration to totality simply means the ability to make connections. Under capitalism, from a social, political, and philosophical perspective, the proletariat is a game changer since it has the potential to grasp the totality, what Jameson calls the epistemological privilege, meaning with that the condition of possibility of new thinking inherent in this particular class position of the proletariat. New thinking, in this case, means the capacity to think in terms of process, in contrast to reification, which Jameson sees as blocks and limits to knowledge, what suppresses the ability to grasp totalities. So, along these lines, we try to explore Lukács's approach to the problem of organization, since Lukács understood that there are great divergences in the maturity of class consciousness attained by workers within economically similar strata, and the process of acquiring consciousness does entail a terrible internal ideological crisis for the proletariat. So exactly this brings us to the final essay of History and Class Consciousness, towards a methodology of the problem of organization, which is surprisingly often overlooked in contemporary discussions, when Lukács specifically refers to the Communist Party as one of the most important intellectual questions of the revolution. We think that it is important to consider that the background when Lukács was writing on the problem of organization, suffice it to mention that he was living in exile in Vienna and participated in the leadership of the illegal Hungarian Communist Party. And Lukács, during that period, had no hesitation in risking arrest to travel from Vienna to Budapest during the Horthy dictatorship for weekly clandestine meetings with leading communist workers in Budapest to organize study groups to discuss the tactics and methods of working within the trade unions and oversee the party's semi-legal press. And of course, Lukács intervened in the internal debates of the Communist Party of Hungary, working closely with the leader of the Railway Workers' Union, Landler, opposing the ultra-left sectarian orientation represented by Bela Kun in the Hungarian Communist Party. In general, as George Steiner pointed out, Lukács lived the 20th century like few people on the planet, bearing witness to its many historical events, being what the Greek word martyras originally means, not martyr, but witness. And we think that this is important when we examine Lukács's approach to the problem of organization. So we then bring into the discussion in our article Guy Debord's critical comments on Lukács's conception of the party. While in Society of the Spectacle, Debord creatively develops Lukács's concept of reification. He disagrees with Lukács on the theory of organization, the theory of the Communist Party. And Debord argues that Lukács had drawn an imaginary portrait of the party, describing as, I'm quoting Debord, actual merits of the Bolshevik Party, as actual merits of the Bolshevik Party, everything that the Bolshevik Party was not. In our view, Debord is wrong to present Lukács's conception of the party as idealized imaginary portrait. Lukács is well aware of the fact that if reification is overcome at one point, the danger immediately arises that the state of consciousness that led to that victory might itself atrophy into a new form of reification. So the Communist Party in this sense is in a constant struggle to tear away the reified veils that cloud the consciousness of the individual in capitalist society. And exactly in order to achieve this aim, Lukács argues that iron discipline is needed and the demand for total commitment of the party members. However, it is crucial to mention that Lukács is cautious to criticize a situation in which the party consists merely of a hierarchy of officials isolated from the mass and ordinary members given the role of passive onlookers in the internal life of the party. As Panagiotis Sotiris correctly points out, instead of using simple military metaphors of the party as general headquarters, Lukács speaks about spaces of collective thinking, practice, and transformation. Indeed, Lukács describes the inner life of the party as one unceasing struggle against its capitalist inheritance. And according to our view, this statement is anything but an idealized imaginary portrait of the party, as Debord argues. So, in the first part of our article, we try to provide an answer to critical comments to Lukács's conception of the party, and at the same time build bridges between the final essay of History and Class Consciousness and previous essays, and especially Lukács's conception of reification. And in our approach, we agree with Frederick Jameson that History and Class Consciousness is an unfinished project, an open Leninist book. And wherever else it sends us, it also ought to send us back to the fundamental philosophical problem of the party itself, and in particular of the Leninist party. So I'm now giving the floor to Alexandros for the second part of our article.
Hi, hello everyone. Once again, we are really thankful to Victor and Mariana and Historical Materialism for organizing all of this. So far we've been discussing the subjective factor, the Leninist, the vanguard party, and the objective conditions, the class struggle itself as a process. But of course, discussing this interplay in itself doesn't mean anything. The interplay between subjective and objective factors doesn't mean anything in itself. So Lukács adds two important conceptual parameters within this interplay. The one, as already mentioned by Costas, is the notion of totality, that in order to grab this interplay, we need to move towards an understanding of class relations within capitalism as a totality. The second one, which we think is really crucial, is the notion of the decisive moment, the Augenblick. And this is the point where that forms a bridge between the vanguard party, which becomes a revolutionary party, a truly vanguard party, once it grasps this decisive moment, and the objective process, the process of the revolutionary change. So, So what is a moment? This is part of the Lukács' work on talisman, the dialectic, where he defines the moment as a situation whose duration may be longer or shorter, but which is distinguished from the process that leads up to it, in that it forces together the essential tendencies of that process and demands that a decision be taken over the future direction of the process. That is to say, the tendencies reach a sort of zenith, and depending on how the situation concerned is handled, the process takes on a different direction after the moment. So this is a central point in Lukács' conceptual roadmap to social change, the fact that the objective tendencies towards social transformation concatenate into moments of decision. And within these short, relatively brief moments in time, the subjective factor, meaning the vanguard party and the most conscious, class-conscious members of the proletariat, are able to effectively guide social transformation. And of course, that's why Levy notes that there is a dialectical interaction between subject and object in general, but in the Augenblick, this component, the subjective one, gives the direction of event in the form of revolutionary consciousness and praxis. So Lukács doesn't provide us with a subjectivist approach, but tries to define this specific time frame within which the Revolutionary Party can effectively can affect change. So, of course, Lukács is inspired by Lenin, and more specifically by Lenin between April and October 1917, texts like Marxism and Insurrection, and a lot of letters by Lenin to the Central Committee of the party, where he emphasizes the importance of timing within revolutionary politics. So Lenin often tries to attempt and persuade the Bolshevik party of the importance of actions, of choices made by a political subject that at this specific moment understands the chance and possibilities that have opened up. And of course, Lukács builds his theory of the Augenblick around the last letter sent by Lenin to the Central Committee one day prior to the revolution, where he notes that I urge comrades to realize that everything now hangs by a thread. History will not forgive revolutionaries for procrastinating when they could be victorious today, and they certainly will be, while they risk losing much tomorrow. In fact, they risk losing everything. To delay action is fatal. But Lukács ties this Leninist intervention by Lenin into the overall notion of concrete analysis of the concrete situation, which takes the form of the culmination of all genuine theory, its consummation, the point where it therefore breaks into practice. So we have Augenblick serves both as a point of convergence between subjective and objective factor, but also a point of convergence between theory and practice, a point where they become indistinguishable. Of course, Lukács has been criticized by this notion. The Augenblick has been described as an idealized form of politics of will. So this critique goes that Lukács tried to replace the mechanistic determinism of Second International with a subjectivist approach. But Lukács has also learned in writing Talisman and the Dialectic from his own mistakes, from his own misreading of the German Revolution and the opportunistic movement in March 1923. So Lukács warns of a left theory of moments that ignores the instant of dialectical change, the concrete revolutionary essence of the moment. And in that sense, Lukács says that insurrection as an art is turned into insurrection as a game. The well-warranted active role of the subject turns into an empty phraseology of subjectivism. So, in that sense, Lukács does not overlook the objective factor, but speaks exactly of this notion of the party that understands the tendencies that lead towards an Augenblick. We think that this is a crucial way in which we need to establish a Lukácsian politics of the 21st century. Within a context, as Daniel Ben Said notes, of an eclipse of strategic reasoning, Lukács offers us some certain crucial concepts upon which we can discuss our current conjuncture, we can discuss the defeat of social movements and leftist parties in the past decades. We need, in that sense, we want to expand the notion of Augenblick, in order to guide us into today's politics, even if revolutionary change is not on the agenda, we need to understand this intervention that the vanguard party is in the process of becoming, is constantly judged under its ability or inability to grasp these crucial moments of social transformation. And that's why we think that contemporary thinkers and Marxists like Fominaya or Comrade Gaetanu notes that during this heightened period of class struggle in the last decade, we had those moments that the role of class consciousness was fundamental, and therefore we need to understand history as a process that is defined as a field of possibility. And that's why we think that Lukács offers us the valuable tools to do so. So in a sense, we don't speak of recipes for the cookshop of the future, but we advocate for a political reading of history and class consciousness. So, as Costas said, HCC should be understood as an open-ended, as a Leninist book that calls us to rethink politics and revolutionary actions in our age. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Costas and Alexandros. Of course, now we don't have much time for questions and discussion. I'll give the word to Victor to pose any questions that he has. I also have a couple of questions, but this is just to give a taste of the paper, so to speak. It's not our hope here to exhaust the discussion, but to invite further discussion. And before I give the word to Victor, I'd just like to reinforce that everyone that is interested can download the papers. It's open access, free. The journal is available online. The link is on the description of this video. And I would also like to emphasize that there was we had 7 original articles. 3 of them are in Spanish and 4 of them are in English. 3 of them are these 3 that were presented just now. And the 4th one is by Spiros Potamias, who unfortunately could not join us today, but also like to invite everyone to have a look at his paper, which is called Du musst dein Leben ändern, the categorical continuity of Lukácsian thought from history and class consciousness to the specificity of the aesthetic. That said, Victor, if you want to say some observations about the papers. If any of you also have observations about the other papers, you're welcome to formulate them. And then I'll give back the word to the authors to give a very brief response, like 3 to 5 minutes each. Like I said, it's just to warm up future discussions. Victor?
Yeah, thanks, Mariana. Thanks for the presentations to all 3 of you. So very briefly, starting with Till, I was wondering if you could reflect more on the political stakes of this critical conception of time. You brought this right at the very end with the conclusion of your paper, which is very dense, philosophically very dense, but I think has a political edge to it, embedded to it, that is being suggested throughout. And I was wondering if you could exploit that. For instance, you very clearly position yourself against Agamben's critique of Marx's concept of time. Agamben, from what you write, assumes that Marx incorporates this linear, abstract, dead concept of time, that his own concept of time cannot differentiate itself from that. So I was wondering if you could reflect on that. There's a lot of, your article, there's a lot of things to think about, reflecting on it. I think maybe the concept of totality, maybe the first appearance that it makes in Capital is exactly in chapter 1, when the question of the measure of the quantum of value in a specific commodity is explained through taking into account abstract labor of everyone involved. In a way, it brings every worker every worker's activity in to be able to say how much value is crystallized in each commodity. I was wondering if that makes sense. You have a kind of absolute synchronicity in that sense, but which is a fetishized one. I guess it's impenetrable. It's something we have no control over. And of course, another constant theme in history and class consciousness with regard to capitalist time is this preponderance of dead labor over living labor, which Lukács says is a clear manifestation of reification and something we have to overcome. So, especially in the way that the past controls the present, or the past imposes its determinants over the present. So, I think your essay gives us a lot to think about. And after reading it, to go back to history and class consciousness and read it from the standpoint of the question of time. So just I wanted to thank you for that, and feel free to just reflect on these issues. To Matt, before I ask you the question, I just wanted to make a short comment on what happened after the call. A call of papers means you don't really know what's going to arrive, and we had several suggestions of topics, and one of the topics that was present in several articles, including yours, is the question of continuity or dialogue between the work of the late Lukács and the early Marxist Lukács, so between HCC and works that come later. Like Mariana said, we have, by Spiros Potamias, wrote a consideration about the continuities between the HCC and the aesthetic. We also have an article in Spanish about the continuities between HCC and especially the critique of reification and the critique of alienation and the ontology of social being by Leonardo Lopresti from Argentina. And finally, of course, Sharpe and Matthew King on the continuities between the destruction of reason and history and class consciousness. And my question is more, I wanted to just hear you reflect on what your article tells us about the politics of reading Lukács, or the whole tensions in this reception, right? How do his different phases as a Marxist, how can we put them in dialogue, or how can they illuminate each other? Because there's a tendency for the formation of two camps in the reception, or one that draws a clearer separation between HCC and what came later, especially what came after the 1930s and HCC itself. And in a way, the late Lukács is a part of that camp, depending how you read his preface, his very self-critical preface. I mean, sometimes I feel the self-critique is a bit exaggerated, but again, that's because I'm in the camp that sees a more unitary trajectory, basically. I just want to make the note that we made a point to have authors and editors and participants in this whole initiative that are on different sides of this issue, because we feel we learn from each other. So people who are closer to Lukács from HCC and who are more in dialogue with his later work. And it's been a very, I think, fruitful occasion to put these people in dialogue. I'm not sure if that's still the best way to confront his work. Finally, to Costas and Alexandros, where again the political edge, we have the conceptual roadmap, but the transition to praxis is already present in the title. And you guys close the article with the consideration of the Greek case as in a way as a negative example of not seizing the moment. More specifically, the question of the referendum of July 5th, 2015, and Syriza not taking the mandate of the no to the Troika policies and reversing course. And in a way, we're still in that moment, I guess, that began on July 5th, where it's still resonating, I guess. So I'd ask you guys to maybe say something about that as an example also of how useful this work can still be to understand contemporary politics and the theoretical challenges that arise from them. and also organizational, right? He tries to bridge these two dimensions. That's the whole, I think, idea of HCC. But I guess that's it. Yeah. So, Mari, do you have some questions?
Yeah, I have just a couple of comments. I'll refrain from asking questions due to how advanced the time already is. Before, I just wanted to see if anyone else wants to ask each other any questions. A brief question, we would have time for that, but if not, very brief comment on it's interesting because we already had read the papers and established connection between them, but now hearing you present them, new connections have been made in my mind, and one of them connects Till's paper with Alexandros and Costas, which through the idea of crisis. So both papers deal with the question of time in a certain sense, and I was thinking how that relates to Lukács' conception of crisis. In Till's paper, I think the idea of crisis helps us to understand. It would be an alternative way to understand praxis, not in this progressive way, understanding of time, not as this complete break out of time, but crisis as something internal to the development of capitalism might be a useful tool to understand this conception of time that is neither progressive nor complete break. And also, in the case of Costas and Alexandros' paper, maybe I was wondering whether Augenblick or moment of decision, to the extent that it has this subjective factor together with the objective factor, would be a substitute for crisis or would be a complement, because it's something that he addresses more in Taylism and dialectic and crisis in HCC. So I was wondering if that should be a substitute for crisis or a complement. And Matt, both Matts, I think it was very interesting to draw the connection between HCC and the destruction of reason through the idea to the criticism of the problem of irrationality. Because normally we see HCC as a criticism of rationalism or instrumental rationality, and the destruction of reason as a critique of irrationalism, so as if they were opposed. But in fact, there is the discussion of irrationality very strongly also in HCC. My question would be very quickly whether we can also have space or room in Lukács' conception of 54 in the destruction of reason to a criticism of a formal rationality or instrumental rationality, whether we would also have space for that in his later works. So I'll give back the word to the authors in the same order, I guess. Just for some reflections, you don't have to exhaust the questions here, just to start the discussion. So Till, if you want to say if you want to react to the comments, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think this idea about crisis that you mentioned is fascinating and absolutely worth looking into. However, I would like to give a brief reply to Victor's question, which I also think is a good way to clarify what I was talking about. So I want to go backwards through the question. So obviously, what is at stake politically or critically in my paper is exactly this idea of the proletariat as a political class, and the possibility for it to develop a consciousness of its own situation within the totality of capitalism, because we have that so let me start from the theory of revisionism, which, as I said, kind of transposes the the contradiction between proletariat and bourgeoisie to a mere contradiction between poor people and rich people, which are kind of randomly cast together by some sort of empirical malfunction or something. And you kind of have this today, for example, I think very clearly in like leftist liberal talks about precarity, which just like acts as if like if we pay our takeout delivery drivers better, then they won't be kind of part of a class that is the working class, right? So the politics of time here, I think, come into play because through the manner in which the time of the worker is exploited, right, as abstract time through abstract labor, because it's like abstract time that measures abstract labor, and through abstract time, labor becomes abstract and so forth in this interplay. The totality of capitalism makes an appearance, and like to take the way backward to decipher the commodity as an accumulation of reified dead labor allows us to kind of develop a class consciousness as kind of a class acting within a certain historical necessity, and not just like kind of saying, well, we have kind of a rebel or kind of random crowd of poor people. And to finish by drawing on the critique of Agamben that he puts forward against Marx, which is basically that he says that Marx failed to develop a theory of time that is adequate to his theory of history. There is my point, basically, that a theory of time that would be truly Marxist would not be a theory of time equal to, let's say, the Kantian aesthetics, but precisely this theoretization of time ceasing to be time proper, right? Which is kind of then captured in this term of time's carcass, right? Which is just like a mere skeleton of temporality, which gets accumulated and sucked out of the flux of temporality, and also lift the struggle of the reappropriation of the means of production into the field of, let's say, the reappropriation of time as it is, right? Because now exploitation mainly functions by the exploitation of the alienation of our time that we give to the bosses, right, or the capitalists. So that basically is my argument in a nutshell.
Thank you, Theo. Matt? You're muted.
Okay, thank you to both Victor and Mariana for the questions. I understand I need to be relatively brief. Certainly, I think there's a really complex set of political, I guess, debates and divides that surround reading Lukács, debates within Marxism and around the legacy of Stalinism and Lukács's imputed and real role in that history, conceptions of Eastern versus Western Marxism, conceptions of the relationship between Lukács and critical theory. And all of these, I think, play out in debates around continuity and if you like, separatism between the early and the later Lukács. For example, in Ernesto Traverso's strange preface to the Destruction of Reason 2021, he claims that Destruction of Reason is a Stalinist text. He claims it's a Stalinist text. And, of course, then one would, unless one jettisons Lukács completely, one looks elsewhere and finds in History of Class Consciousness resources that would you then need to insulate from the later work. So obviously our paper is pushing against that. We're closer to the more continuous position, certainly in terms of Lukács's critique of bourgeois philosophy and tracing this evolution between this problem of irrationality to the irrationalist kinds of solutions that emerge in Schelling and then are radicalized, according to Lukács, in subsequent thinkers, in particularly within German thought. So to speak a little bit to Mariana's question, which I think is fantastic, about HCC being positioned often as a critique of rationalism and DOR as a critique of irrationalism, is there a place for a critique of formal rationality in the later works? I certainly read Lukács as continuing to be a critic of reification, and accepting the limitations of the understanding as a kind of Hegelian, as against reason, rationality, conceived in the Hegelian mode, is involving forms of dialectic that pass beyond the static categories of the understanding. It's just that, I mean, his argument is that the irrationalist critique of reification really hits, if you like, the symptoms rather than the causes, and is characterized by a refusal to look at the material conditions which generate reification as experienced by individuals and then described very cleverly and sensitively, perhaps by someone like Nietzsche, for whom he continues to have, I think, an ambivalent appreciation, despite being, of course, heavily critical. So I think there is still space for a critique of formal rationality in the later works. It's just that it's coupled to a critique of what he considers to be broadly a false exit, I think, which is to forms of vitalism or existentialism, whose political provenance we know that he becomes increasingly dour about, to say the least. So perhaps that's enough for me to say now.
Great, many thanks. You were going to... Oh, you're finished. Okay.
Was there more that you wanted me to address?
No, I thought that maybe you were going to say something else further, but that's great. Thank you. Costas and Alex?
Okay, I'll go first. As Victor notes, we took a little detour in our paper in discussing the Greek case because we think it's really exemplary of how the concept of Augenblick can be useful in contemporary struggles, and unfortunately it can be useful in understanding defeat of social movements and leftist parties. So I'll be really brief. In the summer of 2015, we have this moment where the essential tendencies of the previous period culminated into a decisive moment. We have a 5-year-long struggle between popular subaltern classes and the ruling class and its international coalition that is imposing neoliberal austerity measures constantly. So it comes down to a header at the referendum in July 2015, and the choice between a yes vote, a yes to a new bailout package and new austerity measures, a new round of privatizations, and the no vote, which is a rejection of these austerity measures, but also it points to the potential of rupture between the Greek state and the EU and the IMF. And so at this point, the no vote gains 61.3%, which, as Sotiris has written, it was a tremendous show of determination from the part of the subaltern classes. So we have a point, we have an emergent class consciousness that is not only rejecting austerity, but it's also have the first signs of a radical, a true alternative to mainstream neoliberal politics. But at this point, both the left in government, the Syriza party, chooses to reverse course, to capitulate to the press, to the international pressures and the internal pressure of the ruling class, feeling that it's unable and it's unwilling and unable to carry on and support the no vote majority. And at the same time, the radical left, the Communist Party, and the extra-parliamentary left are unable to seize this moment and forge a new coalition between segments of the popular classes and the reinvigorated leftist politics. So in this moment, I think that what Victor said is true, that this defeat, our inability to grasp the moment still resonates today. Of course, we are not within the same period, and of course the political juncture in Greece and within Europe has radically been transformed. But the rise of the far right and the revanchistic policies of the neoliberal right and the government of New Democracy in many ways resonate our inability 9 years ago. And to pass on to Costas, just a quick note regarding crisis and the concept of time. I think that Lukács is drawing a lot from Lenin's notion that crisis accelerates time. But he wants to add that while time is accelerated, we don't have a linear, a progressive movement towards class consciousness. In many ways, History and Class Consciousness is a book that addresses the question why, during periods of crisis, large segments of the proletariat still remain under the leadership of the bourgeois class. And part of this debate is that through this acceleration of time, we have these crucial nodes that these minorities, the class conscious minority of the proletariat, can affect change, can gain in a different vocabulary, which gain a hegemonic point of hegemony within society.
Well, I would be very brief because I think that Alexandros really covered the main points. Just to add something on Lukács and crisis. I think that Lukács is thinking at the same time economic crisis and the ideological crisis of the proletariat. He's opposed to a mechanistic approach to economic crisis that would simply imply that a severe economic crisis would shake the proletariat's attitude towards the capitalist system, because exactly because of his approach to reification, Lukács understands that large segments of the proletariat remain imprisoned within the confines of capitalist thought, even during a severe economic crisis, because they think that something radically new, of which we have no experience till now, is quite impossible. And this is exactly the ideological crisis of the proletariat. This is exactly why Lukács stresses the importance of Communist Party, of an organization, as the most important intellectual question of the revolution. And integral to it is his approach to revolutionary theory, which is something that unites his thought from the 20s until the early 60s, that lacking a theory, Marxists are condemned just to run behind the events, and theory then is, as he famously said in one of his last interviews, that theory then is just the rationalization of their surprise after the events. So that's for now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I think that's it for the first part. Thank you so much for the authors for presenting their papers. I again encourage everyone to have a look at the full papers at the website of the journal, linked in the chat and in the description. And now let's go to the second part. To the benefit of time, Victor, I think we shouldn't say much about the reader. Just can you give a brief idea of what it is, and then I'll give the word to Mirela.
Yeah, of course. But it's now my turn to say thank you to Paul, because this is the third time that HM has the generosity to host us in something related to what became what we now call this HCC Reader. So the idea to, as an activity, as part of the Centennial, to read the entire book sequentially and to distribute the chapters to different kinds of readers. I mean, we have readers from 7 countries and different disciplines who each took on either one preface or a chapter or a part of a chapter. We divided the reification chapter in 3. And then to kind of reflect together on what we can learn from this kind of in-depth reading and from taking on the whole work, to see if what can we draw that maybe was not seen, or what tensions are present within this work, what elements give it unity. This was the whole idea came from a kind of cryptic suggestion from Lukács in the preface of 1922, where he says, on the one hand, these are essays that came out of concrete political work, or so they're occasional essays coming from party work. On the other, he says that there is a certain unity to this book, and he says you find that in the sequence of the essays. And then he says, so that's how he recommends you should read it, before saying maybe leave reification as the last chapter because it's so complex, which in a way is exactly the opposite of what we do, or most of us, or how it's read, which is basically to read the reification essay in separation of the work, and perhaps maybe read the introductory essay on what is Orthodox Marxism, and very noticeably leave out the more political, well, maybe class consciousness is also, and the question of imputed consciousness isn't something else that appears a lot, but the whole second half of the book is more or less neglected, especially the last chapter on the party, which is something that Costas and Alexandros have already mentioned. So what you find in the journal is the product of also over a year of collective work. So we discussed these chapters together and what we found in them, and above all, we kind of listened to each other and learned from each other. And when we went back to the chapter, to these essays, we found different things in them. So it's definitely a kind of collective endeavor which produced really interesting results. It began as a sequence of presentations at HM Athens last year. We did it online last October again. Then you can find it on the HM YouTube channel. And finally, now it's the written version. So we all had kind of 3 goes at this, and you're welcome to see the result in the journal website. So today we're just going to have a short conversation on that with Mirela Ivanova, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Basel, and this is also just to highlight that this work speaks to many disciplines. We had a more philosophical discussion today with regard to the papers, but we have participants who come from literature studies, from the social sciences, from communication studies, and of course from philosophy. So this work speaks to the humanities, critical humanities across the disciplines. But without further ado, I open the floor to Mirela, who very kindly agreed to chat with us a little bit about this idea, which we call our HCC marathon. So the floor is yours, Mirela. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Yes, first I want to thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I read the HCC Reader with great interest. I think it's a very good, fantastic companion for anyone interested in history and class consciousness, because it offers a rich yet concise compilation of insights. It provides, of course, intriguing facts about Lukács' life and how his biographical journey relates to the creation of the book in this specific version that we have now, and also relates to his subsequent self-criticism. But more importantly, I think that the reader delves into Lukács' core ideas with remarkable clarity, which is probably the greatest achievement of this collection of papers. It also situates his perspectives on historical change, totality, reification, the subject-object relation, class consciousness, and revolutionary praxis within the philosophical, sociological, and political debates that it was embedded in. And I want to emphasize here particularly the interesting insights regarding his ideas about the democratization of the party and the relationship, the mutual relationship between the proletariat and the party, which, as it was already mentioned, often remains unilluminated. The other part that I think it's often not taken much into account or focused on is the idea that is in the struggle itself and in the political praxis itself, that the political aims are being also developed. So it's not something that is completely known in advance. I think that having read the collection before I started myself, delving into the book would have made my life much easier 4 years ago. So I can very much recommend it to people that are now delving into Lukács. I would like to offer some food for thought and open the floor for discussion regarding a few questions that crystallized when I was reading the reader. The questions revolve around the concept of totality and that of free fight or contemplative stance towards it. So let's start with the notion of totality, which I always found fascinating, but also a bit challenging. Challenging not only to grasp, but also to demarcate and employ as a concept to think about contemporary capitalism today. Interestingly, it's part of the legacy of history and class consciousness that the late Lukács himself viewed in a positive light, as Konstantin Berens emphasizes in his paper. And I'm particularly interested in the idea of a capitalist totality, which several papers touch upon in relation to various chapters of the book. So for Lukács, understanding, as it was also explained, understanding any given problem necessitates situating it within a concrete historical totality. So it is essential to grasp the position of individual components, phenomenon, or facts, social facts within a whole, as well as their dynamic relationship to that whole, in order to understand their significance. So these elements aren't static, but they evolve and transform along with the totality itself, reflecting a particular historical social totality that is changing, right? So totality is not the sum of all social relations that might exist in a given society, but the social observer needs to search for those determinations or relations that are of crucial importance for the organization of the concrete society or of the concrete whole that one wants to study and to understand. Now, what does this totality comprise of? As Alexandros Minotakis emphasizes in the paper, the totality could consist of numerous interactions, but the most significant one is the relationship between the subject and the object in the historical process. And to comprehend this relation, we need to examine the relations of production, which serve as the starting point for understanding the totality. And the way in which capital, or better, the logic of capital, socializes society, organizes it, is a specific one. Classes are not defined in terms of inherited social ranks. We have the prevalence of the commodity form, the movement of commodities on the market, etc. I'm not going to go into details here. We all know this. Now it gets a little bit complicated because, as Giovanni Zanotti states, the entire human historical process that now respectively appears as a totality has first actually become such in the capitalist socialized world. Therefore, unlike other past exploited classes, the proletariat lives in a social totality, which implies that capitalism is in fact the first social order to constitute a totality. This occurs because capitalist principles such as the exchange value, surplus accumulation, the commodity form, private property, not only organizes the entire economic fabric of the society, but also penetrates and colonizes, to use Habermas' expression, other social spheres. So to simplify it a little bit in my language, the socialization of all social relations by capital allows individuals to recognize the possibility of socializing society by at this fostering a movement towards a collective conscious and democratic socialization of society. In this sense, Lukács doesn't oppose totality, so to say, but the goal is to achieve a self-transparent totality, as Zanotti points out. In this sense, we can speak of different possible totalities. And in contrast to this self-transparent totality, capitalism is an opaque and contradictory totality. While it encompasses all aspects of society, it remains challenging to fully comprehend it. And due to its fundamental principles, capitalism cannot be rationalized through and through, as Lukács writes. So Zanotti thus emphasizes that capitalism is a failed attempt at a system. And I find Lukács' critique of capitalism as a totality ruled by chance particularly intriguing, because it offers a form of immanent critique, exposing the unattained promise of rationality and efficiency, since the system as a whole is irrational and uncontrollable. Now, having all this in mind, several questions arise or pop up for me. First, if totality is not a concept applicable to all social formations, but is specific to capitalist society, does this imply that we can use it as an epistemological instrument to understand capitalist societies only? Or in other words, does the method that I just outlined at the beginning, connecting the parts to the whole, make sense only if a totality exists? This means if such connections exist in the first place. Secondly, if totality is historical and changeable, I think it's interesting to think about how the capitalist totality has evolved from Lukács' time to the present. So has it changed at all? Do we live in the same totality? And in which way the advent of global financial digital capitalism, etc., has altered it? Has its irrationality and uncontrollability increased over time? And can we speak of one totality existing on the planet, so to say, or do we speak of multiple totalities? And how do we relate this to whether one lives in the global north and the global south, etc.? And is this totality truly all-encompassing, or are there areas that exist outside of its influence, and how can we understand the relationship to the totality? In other words, all of these questions revolve for me around how can we employ, utilize the concept of totality today to understand capitalism. And the other point is that Mariana emphasizes in her paper also that there is a specific standpoint that allows for a qualitatively more penetrating insight to understand these internal connections and mediations between isolated facts. And of course, this is the standpoint of the proletariat, which means that it's also an analytical standpoint from which the analysis needs to proceed if we want to understand these internal connections and mediations between apparently isolated facts. And again, if we consider the totality of today, can we still speak of one single standpoint that allows for such an understanding of all these different facts and phenomena? So if we want to comprehend algorithmic trading as a phenomenon within this totality, from which standpoint should we proceed? And then the other issue, I'll sketch it just briefly, that of course I find very fascinating, is that pertains to the reified or contemplative stance of the subject. And the subject is, so to say, caught between voluntarism and fatalist resignation. These are two reified stances that Lukács describes, and I think different papers relate to them, which I found very interesting. And one of them, the voluntarism, is that of almost a fetishized subject as a motor of social change, the great leader, entrepreneur, genius, seen as capable of solving, for example, social problems or leading society forward. So this is one understanding of social change, that it's not only in academic circles, so to say, but also existed ideologically in the society. The other stance is the resignation to certain facts and belief in laws like social evolution, driving the course of history, where certain social states appear as necessary due to the belief in the unalterable existence of these laws. And a third aspect is the resignation, but one that leads towards seeking answers in inward actions, for example, of inner actions, yes. And I'm interested in addressing this phenomenon of voluntarism, fatalism, or resignation as they exist today. And in this era where capitalist totality breeds multiple crises simultaneously, have these reified stances of the subjects intensified, and what concrete manifestations can we observe? Yeah, this was from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirela, for accepting this invitation to. We wanted to have this outside look also in the reader, and from your standpoint of working with in the project of digital alienation, we were very happy to have you accept the invitation and bring these very interesting points to the discussion. Now we could react a little bit to Mirela's points. Anyone actually here that wants to chime in is welcome. Victor, would you like to start? Or Alexandros and Costas are also welcome, or anyone? Yeah.
I can start unless you want to go first.
No, you can start.
Okay. Thanks, Mirela. This is for like absolutely brilliant intervention, and of course it's very rewarding to hear that this was worthwhile for you as well. Especially the thing with the accessibility, I think was a point that cuts through the different essays, is to make this work more approachable, to provide pathways to contextualize it, but also in terms of the heavy conceptual charge of the book, that most of the essays try to provide a kind of introduction to working with these critical concepts. So that's exactly the idea. I think it's very cool that you center on totality and what we can still draw from this critical concept and what problems appear. Not only how does it help us engage with history and class consciousness and the whole apparatus of concepts that's in it, but also the whole current questions and political questions that you bring. I think to answer that, just to make a little reflection, because you raised so many important questions. The one about was there not a totality before the existence of capitalism? And I think there are different ways to answer this. The first one is, I would say, the things that are in the background of Lukács's discourse or treatment. So I think it's very clear that what Lukács has in mind is the very historical and concrete fact that capitalism works by making connections and by connecting different producers, different parts of the world from the very beginning. That's its nature, right? It's a connecting social force. But at the same time that it connects, it subjugates, it creates asymmetries between those that it's connecting, between the classes, the different regions. If we think about imperialism and colonialism, this is, to me, very clear from the manifesto to Capital, and it's implicit. The fact that the totality also refers to the global character of capitalism. It's not often expressly said by Lukács, but it's in the background. He does talk about anti-colonial struggle, for example, in the book. And when he talks about the capitalist whole, he is thinking of it in a global sense, which would, again, bring this idea that you said, what about the different worlds that we have, or the center-periphery dynamic. I think it fits the Lukács' regard in the sense that the notion of this of capitalism as a whole doesn't negate all the asymmetries and hierarchies and processes of subjugation that exist between different elements of that whole, right? And so capitalism has this contradictory kind of dynamic where it connects, but in connecting it subjugates, and capitalism connects but produces isolation and produces fragmentation. That's the whole contradiction. And then to overcome the isolation and the fragmentation, you have to resort to its own, to what it offers you, to commodity exchange, to the market, to forces that are out of your control, to overcome the problem that it creates. In a way, this kind of isolating connectivity. And this is the kind of dynamic that he's approaching. And it's too bad we don't have Giovanni present, because I think his essay takes this question on directly. And he has this very provocative thesis of only the totality, an actual totality, not the capitalist whole, but a totality that overcomes it, a different social reality that is also global but non-antagonistic, that only that would be open. And I won't summarize. I think everyone should read this incredible essay by Giovanni. But I think what he means is he's opposing capitalism as a whole that is it's a whole that is fragmented. So it's not a real totality in that sense. And it's not a real totality because it actually posits itself as something closed. And to Giovanni, this would say, if it's entirely closed, which means it excludes any kind of alternative, any kind of opening to a different reality, it excludes different tendencies. This means it's not a real totality. A totality would be effectively open to be one. That's his whole thesis. And I think it makes sense in the sense that if we think of historical development as capitalism connects and creates this global reality, but creates it through fragmentation, subjugation, and isolation of the parts, and overcoming that reality, the revolutionary overcoming of that reality would be to promote what in the Feuerbach thesis appears as a socialized humanity, right? A social humanity, which does not yet exist. And then, like you say, is this totality, what's the nature of this totality, right? And I guess here again to say something, to make a reference to something I think Giovanni would agree with, the totality for Lukács is real from in the sense, or this reality we want to create that overcomes the dead kind of closed whole of capitalism has a different nature from the standpoint of praxis. So for Lukács, the criteria will be always it's not exactly that because we see the totality in a different way that it overcomes the current capitalist whole, but because we can mobilize it from the standpoint of praxis. So a totality that goes against and overcomes the dead capitalist whole is different because the fact that this connection is no longer antagonistic, and we are conscious members of this totality, it becomes something we can mobilize from the standpoint of praxis. And so I would say it's this praxis kind of standpoint that provides the critical edge of the concept of totality as against just this total fragmented whole of capitalism. And so just to finish, like you said, what do we do with the global south? What do we do with center periphery? I think, again, if we reflect more on the political stakes of this work and the question of the party, from the standpoint of totality, the question of internationalism is in the background. That a revolutionary politics of the totality is also an internationalist politics. But this is the element that I would say is the least developed in the more political essays of history and class consciousness, and I think this is an open task for us. What would an internationalist politics that, from the standpoint of totality, what is it like? how do we conceptualize it? How do we operationalize it? What does it look like organizationally? What does the chapter on the party tell us about organization across borders? Because I don't think he's talking about the party in a single country. But these are all kind of, reflections that came from this whole work and inspired by your question. And I guess the whole takeaway is you can't really operate from this standpoint of totality without mediations. And the mediations are exactly what allow us to get away from this, like you said, voluntarism on one side, which you connected to entrepreneurialism, which is very interesting. I guess Lukács was thinking of like more anarchist, ultra-leftist currents in his critique. And the fatalism, right? We're stuck between the fatalism, nothing can be done, and voluntarism, which are two attitudes that are embedded in the system, a system that fetishizes innovation and change, but change that only produces sameness, right? Capitalism is the only system that believes that you have to have constant change, but to continuously reproduce the same system according to the same determinants, even if it has a different makeup. And I definitely think we should go back to HCC to conceptualize and kind of empirically theorize the new manifestations of reification. I definitely think it's not enough, and that there's a lot of work to be done there, especially in your field of study, with all this digital and technological or the presence of technology and mobile technology and algorithms, all of that as mediators in our social lives. There's definitely a lot of work to be done there in dialogue with Lukács. But basically, without these mediations, which are of the different nature but always collective, it's class consciousness, it's the standpoint of the proletariat, it's revolutionary theory and the revolutionary organization. What brings them together, and in a way they're only possible in if they're connected in a way, is that they are collective mediations that break both this dead totality or dead hole of capitalism and the isolation that it puts us in. That's how I understand Lukács's political message and the centrality of the category of mediation. He's constantly looking for ways to break exactly these polarities that were constantly thrown into by this reality. But I'll stop there. This was already pretty long. Thank you so much for this reflections and for taking the time to read the essays, Mirela. And I'll pass the floor to Mariana now. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Do you, Costas and Alexandros, also want to chime in?
Yes, I'll try to be brief. There was an excellent presentation and excellent points by Mirela. Regarding totality, first of all, I would like to note that now there is what's dominant is a capitalist, a bourgeois understanding of totality that is being propagated by this merge between neoliberal ideology and technological determinism. That's the capitalist understanding of totality propagated by Meta, Google, and Microsoft, stating that our society, the whole world, is an ensemble of facts, is an aggregation of facts and data. And Lukács offers us a crucial starting point to criticize this neo-tech reasoning, stating that a situation in which the facts speak out unmistakable for or against a definite course of action has never existed and neither can or will exist. And Lukács offers us these crucial tools, mediation and totality, to go beyond this. There's this notion in critical technological studies, this dataism, this understanding of society as an aggregation of data. And I think it's the work by Christian Fuchs on this point is really helpful, because he says that, okay, we need to discuss the mediation between the physical and the digital realm, but because it's not just the physical and digital realm, but physical and digital within the context of global capitalism, then the notion of reification is crucial, is the one that allows us to mediate, because we can't speak of the digital realm and data extraction and the an alienated online presence without understanding the link between what Lukács speaks about, reification within the actual physical production process that's been expanded through data production among social networking sites, and now by our interaction with artificial intelligence online. So I think now we need to understand this part of our world, let's say the digital world, as part of an expansion of this reification, and to understand how digital and physical capitalism underpin one another. So, for example, at this point, we have these liberal critiques of data extraction. We have this really well-known book by Shoshana Zuboff, Surveillance Capitalism. But at the core of this critique is that we need to separate between good old traditional capitalism that produces and is beneficial to society, and this new viral form of capitalism, that it's digital capitalism, which mainly extracts and offers us an alienated experience. It's interesting that Shoshana Zuboff and liberal critiques of digital capitalism, they're also trying to develop a critique of alienation. But as they are lacking the notion of reification, as they are lacking a critique of commodity fetishism, then they end up completely disrupting the link between the physical and the digital world. And that's where Lukács is really helpful, to reunite our reified disparate existence in all these fields. So it's not just about I'm feeling alienated from my online persona on social media. I'm feeling alienated from my online persona because I'm also alienated from the fruits of my labor process. I'm alienated from the labor process itself. And that's what's feeding right now this whole development within global capitalism.
Well, I don't have the answer, but I just wanted to point out that what Mirela said about totality or totalities in the plural is something that I have been thinking about it a lot, and it's also the same question if it is the Communist Party or it could be the Communist parties in the plural in one country or beyond different countries. But I think that what is precisely the crucial fact is that the standpoint of the proletariat is not is different from a point of view, because it is always constructed by practice. So this kind of knowledge of the totality, or this knowledge of the totalities in the plural, is not the knowledge that is restricted to one's own head, and it is always related to practical critical activity. I think this does not give us the answer, but it might give us the way towards the answer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Costas and Alexandros, as well. I think we're already over 2 hours of debate, so I think we should wrap up. I would just also like to agree with what Victor said about totality, about it being, we can understand that in different ways. So there's, let's say, a closed and an open totality, like capitalism would be a closed totality, and the standpoint of totality that Lukács talks about is this, in which Giovanni addresses in his paper. And by the way, Giovanni is in the chat and said that, Victor, you summarized well his position. So is this idea of dialectics, and how is a totality fraught with contradiction, and it's a moving totality and it's an open totality. And I think your question, Mirela, is crucial. So is this idea of totality an epistemological tool to understand pre-capitalist formations or not capitalist formations that exist contemporaneous to capitalism, or a post-capitalist society? I think that's a very I don't have the answer, of course, but I think that's a crucial question. And I think Lukács dealt with this idea, and that touches upon the idea of dialectics of nature or not, or dialectics is only to analyze social categories. I think it's a very interesting question. And regarding standpoint and one or more standpoints, unique standpoint or more, it's also a crucial question for our times. We have other like feminist standpoint theories and other standpoint theories, which I think enrich the debate, but also I am very skeptical of this a kind of arithmetic conception of standpoints, that the more the better. So it's like a perspectivist conception. So we lose the idea of totality. So that's the challenge, how to understand these different standpoints as part of a totality as well, that has structural implications for the reproduction of society. I think that's the challenge. And I think that's a very nice way to end today's talk, because I think history and class consciousness might not offer us like all the answers, but I think it poses questions that 100 years, so 1 century after it was published, are still burning questions that we don't have a clear answer to, and we must strive to find them not only in theory, but also in practice, as Lukács emphasizes. So thank you so much all for being here in these many different time zones, and for this discussion. It was very nice to see some of you in person, that we had only exchanged emails and discussed in written form. It was very nice to see you and to have this discussion. I'll finish inviting and encouraging everyone to check out the full papers in the website. Also saying that for those who speak Spanish, we'll also have a second launching in Spanish and Portuguese, probably in the channel of the University of Campinas, but we'll circulate the call soon. And also encourage you to submit your papers if you want to the Dissonancia Critical Theory Journal, and also to Historical Materialism. If you can support historical materialism, we are very thankful for the space that they have given us, not only in the conference in Athens, but here in the channel as well, to have this discussion. Victor, do you want to say something more? If not, that's it. Thank you so much, everyone. We're very happy to have this discussion with you.
Thank you.